Greetings, everyone. It is lovely to see all of you. My name is Natalie Bennett. I am the director for the Women's Leadership and Resource Center and the Campus Advocacy Network. My pronouns are she, they, and doctor. The I want to kind of pause for a second and just say that this conversation that we're about to have today is really a long time coming. And as we're talking in the just before the program began, we floated this conversation, this idea for bringing women's centers across the city, across the state together in some kind of formal way to talk about what we are doing individually, but what we can build together. I recall that and Russo was part of those earlier conversations. Sekile Nzinga from Northwestern was part of those conversations. We've talked about it at staff meetings, but we never quite landed because of time, of resources, of physical energy to be able to do the work, and of course, the pandemics. But for all of the difficulty that COVID-19 has presented for us, and in all the ways that it has, there is actually something it has given us that we can actually use. And that is this virtual way of connecting, of dialoguing, of listening, of getting recharged, of thinking about the named and unnamed work that we do in our different ways without having to physically move from wherever we are right now. So I want to say thank you to all the speakers for saying yes enthusiastically. I will say a little bit more later, but what I first want to do is to ask Dr. Amalia Palares, who is Associate Chancellor and Vice Provost for Diversity, to welcome you and to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I was just unmuting. Welcome to all of you. Excited to welcome you from the different institutions, Western Illinois, Chicago State, Northwestern, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and DePaul. I was very excited to think about the topic of care among sort of one of the areas that is going to be discussed today as something caring for ourselves, for others, as something that's central to community organizing, to social movements, and that seeks to remediate the tolls on the bodies and emotions that are created by structural inequities, by human rights abuses, by disenfranchisement. Radical care as work with vulnerable communities in precarious situations is something that is very much in our thoughts, especially in the recent years. In many different instances, there are situations that impede or undermine care work within communities that are in very precarious conditions, that are deprived, and that call for collective organizing. Historically, for example, I'm thinking about the women of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, or the mothers of Juarez, whose children were disappeared and murdered. In my own research, the work with immigrant families who are separated through detention and deportation, and that all these kinds of different developments require thinking beyond outside traditional models of care and moving towards collective and radical care of the very same people that are deprived of their own ability to care. But care can also be used as a justification for unpaid labor, for reinforcing social hierarchies, for defining or implying that some groups are more worthy of care than others. So because of this complexity, I think care requires a lot of thought, a lot of reflection, a lot of intentionality. What models and frameworks of care look like in one moment are different than what they should look like in another. What it looks like for one population is different than for another. And how it aligns with our goals of social justice and equity also needs to be a center of focus. This praxis, the everyday doing and thinking about this care, is a prime activity sustained by you, by the leaders of women and gender equity centers. It is through your leadership with student populations and the broader set of university populations that we learn more about how this work can best be done and how we can create a community of care in our campus. So I want to thank you for all your work and reflection and for all that you are going to share today with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Amalia. And as the focus of our 30th anniversary programming connects three big ideas, right? Care, community, and resistance. And as I've been kind of reflecting on how we got to those concepts, first is a recognition that, as Amalia said, they're always part of social justice struggles. They're always part of the work that minoritized groups, that disenfranchised peoples in different places enact, use as tools, as sometimes as blankets, as comfort, as ways of making space. And so part of what we wanted to explore through today's roundtable are the ways in which we make space, the ways in which we build connections, given the kinds of resources that we have or don't have access to. Some of us are state institutions under significant financial stress. Others of us are in fairly well-resourced spaces. Some of us work out of and do incredible programming out of tiny rooms. Other of us have spacious places with views. The variety, the diversity of training that we've had to step into this work, that's also part of the conversation. So with all of that, how do we do the work of care? How do we respond to the kinds of incursions on our spirit, our collective spirits, or well-being before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and certainly continuing? So as I'm talking, I'm thinking about what is happening with Haitian feminist movements in Haiti right now as they resist a dictatorship. Haiti is connected to Chicago in a very direct way, right? There are Haitian communities here that have been here for a very long time. In fact, the Jean Dussab, who is the kind of first Black colonizer in this space, right? So we're talking about like who was here and how they got here. So I say all that to remind us that even as we're talking today, we're also looking for threads, looking for ways to stitch things together, looking for opportunities to hold each other up, and to remind us that this is the first of many conversations that I hope that we'll have going forward. Let me introduce our moderator, who is no stranger to me and to many of us, Dr. Jennifer Ash, who is currently the Associate Director of the National Women's Studies Association, and who holds a PhD in US History and Gender and Women's Studies from UIC. Her dissertation was titled Invincible, Not Invisible, Black Women and Resistance at Black Colleges, 1957 to 2018. And part of what, of course, Jennifer's work reminds all of us is that the work of building spaces that address the intersections of race and gender and class and sexuality, the work of building spaces that we now call women's and gender and equity centers, have not only been at predominantly white institutions, they've not only been at places in the Northeast and the Midwest, they've actually been everywhere. And in fact, some of the most powerful centers are actually at historically Black institutions. Jen earned a BA in history from Western Carolina University and a master's in US history. I lost my place, sorry. from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Jen is very much a woman of the South. Jen has experience teaching gender and women's studies, African American studies, and history. She was a former faculty at Bennett College, and one of the historically Black women's colleges in the US. Jen has amazing organizing experience, organizing in academic spaces, in grassroots spaces, social justice spaces. Jen formerly served as a member of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which is and continues to fight for space to recognize the survivors of police torture in Chicago. Jen is also the founder of Aspirations, which makes beautiful things and generates and donates to Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations in Chicago. So please welcome Jen Ash.
Thank you, Natalie. That was a very generous and kind and thoughtful, probably the most lovely that anyone has ever given me. So thank you, Natalie.
You deserve it.
I'm happy to be here. It's an honor to be here. You know, I did a lot of the writing of my dissertation, physically sitting in the center for several years while I was at UIC, and a lot of amazing work came out of the center when I was there under your guidance. And so I'm very honored to be here today and to meet all of you and get to know folks that are at other centers. The only other person that's at a center here that I personally know is Anne. And so I get to meet so many new people at centers. So that's a fantastic thing. Just as a note, NWSA supports not just academic departments, but women's and gender equity centers. And so I'm thrilled to be able to support those centers through that work as well. So I'm going to get started by asking everyone who is talking today from their respective center to give us a little background knowledge about your center, the history, how it formed, what campus you're on, and institutionally where you're located, that sort of thing. But then also not just historically, but looking at things now, how are you structured? And how your center is a site for resistance on your campus. So Sarah Brown agreed to go first. And so I'm gonna let Sarah talk, and then Anne, maybe you can go next, and then we'll pass it on. Okay, Sarah.
Great, thank you. And thank you for picking the second person so I don't have to do that. I am so excited to be here today. I'm Sarah Brown. I use she, her pronouns. I am the program manager at the Women's Center at Northwestern. And let's see, I'm supposed to introduce myself too. I came into working at women's centers because as a graduate student, I worked at the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender at Brown University. And that was such a positive experience for me. It was also, along the thoughts of care, the place on campus where I could bring my child to work with me and not get like side eye from people, and could feel welcomed, and felt like it was a place where I could be productive and be valued. So that was sort of how I came to know about women and gender equity centers. And then I started working here a couple years ago. So I did my PhD at Brown in American Studies. My dissertation is called Disorder, Giving Form to Feeling in the Late 20th Century United States. And what that means is that my research has to do with how cultural productions resisted sort of like white heteropatriarchal notions of mental health and familial relationships in the late 20th century. And that is something that I teach about from time to time. So I wanted to start talking about our center from the question of resistance, because I don't want to run out of time. That's the best part. One is sort of obvious, but I think worth saying anyway, is that we resist by being a partner and an advocate beyond the things that like are in our name, right? So sure, women and gender, but I think as folks who work in any sort of social justice oriented arm of an institution know. If there is a group who is being underserved or mistreated, it takes all of us getting upset about that and being together to make that change, as opposed to just those folks who are specifically named or targeted at any moment. And I think that the Women's Center history at Northwestern has a strong reputation for that, for advocating for the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, which is our sort of LGBTQIA space. We used to run the Changemakers program, which was a racial healing dialogue series here at Northwestern. Another thing that also I think is on the theme of today has to do with hosting events and holding space in ways that center our shared humanity over hyper production and elitism that are some of the most pernicious things on this particular campus. And those, yeah, so to be of restorative space in that sense. And we resist by treating the people on our campus who are activating for social justice with the respect that they deserve. That bar feels really low, that we're simply not trying to condescend or criminalize student activism. But in truth, I think having a space that isn't paternalistic, but that is also, I think, to echo the comments that Dr. Polaris made at the beginning, a kind of care that isn't trying to satiate a desire for justice. It isn't trying to be a balm that like quiets things down, but something that holds your work up and values you. I think that that is actually a really important role that we strive to serve. So our center came from, there was a program on women in the mid-70s, was an academic arm. And the way I've heard this history told is that folks were coming to those faculty members seeking the kind of advocacy and support they might have found from a women's center. So that started people sort of activating towards building one. And then this center has been here since 1986. It used to be the program on women was on one floor, actually right where I'm sitting, and the Women's Center was on the first floor. And then the program on women moved out into an academic building, and they became the Gender and Sexuality Studies department program. Actually, they're not a department. Where we sit institutionally is, sorry, I skipped a whole center. So we also have a center in Chicago on Lakeshore Drive. And Northwestern's Chicago campus is mostly the law school, professional studies, and the medical school. And so programming for them actually has to be very different because this is a different group of people. We sit institutionally in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and which is within the Provost's office. And the biggest thing that means for us is that we are staff, student, and faculty facing. A lot of the people that we partner with on campus are under student affairs. And so part of what we do sometimes is the Women's Center kind of serves as a way to offer resources to staff and faculty that would otherwise only be available to students, to say like, we're partnering with CARE or CAPS. These are, you know, like for mental health support, we're going to offer these same workshops, but we're going to do them for staff and faculty. And so we've tried to spread resources that way. It also, for me, it means that I think it's a very feminist objective to try to take down some of these hierarchies however we can between students, graduate students, faculty, staff. And we are well positioned to do that, which is something I really appreciate, to try to do our planning around shared areas of interest, shared struggles, as opposed to what role you play within the university. We usually have 4 full-time staff and a couple of undergraduate student staffers. Things are kind of in flux at the moment. Yeah, a couple of things that I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going over time, so I'm gonna speed up. Things that have come and gone. We used to have a licensed counselor and we no longer do. And that has shifted our work. I can talk about it more as we go along if people are interested. We do theme-driven work. So every year we have a theme. Our theme this year was mutual aid and community engagement. That's something I really like because it allows us to talk to new people every year as our theme changes. And we do a symposium along with that. We have a feminist in residence program that is about to go into its second year. The applications are actually coming in right now, which is a way for us to bridge sort of campus work with the Chicago community by hosting a stipended activist, artist, or engaged scholar for the year to try to make these connections. So that's something that we have. Something that we're doing, my own background includes some study in like public humanities and digital humanities. And so I've been trying to make that happen at our center a little bit more. I'm working with a student named Aaliyah Berryman to build a feminist audio campus tour. It's a GPS campus tour that we're gonna have come out this spring. So I feel like that was a lot of stuff. So I'm gonna stop there and let Anne speak, but thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sarah, and also thank you, Ramona and Natalie and Jen, all for setting the stage for this and for inviting me to this. And wow, I mean, already I'm thinking of so many different things. So I'll try to start. I'm Anne Russo. I am the director of the Women's Center at DePaul University in Chicago, and I'm also a professor in women's and gender studies. And I'm so excited to be the director of the Women's Center. I've been at DePaul since 1995. And when I came in, I was the first tenure line faculty who was hired in women's and gender studies. And the year that I came, 1995, was the same year that the Women's Center started. And it was under the leadership of Harvette Gray, Dr. Harvette Gray. And we became fast friends and did a lot of collaboration while Harvette was at DePaul. She was only the Women's Center director for a couple of years, and then she switched over to become the director of the Cultural Center. And then Elsa Saeta took over the Women's Center. Both Harvette and Elsa were hired as staff rather than faculty, so it was a full staff line. And they both, I think, did amazing work. Elsa was there until 2017. And so when the Women's Center was organized out of faculty, it came from faculty. It wasn't from student organizing, which is kind of interesting because the Cultural Center also started in 1995, and it started out of student protest. But the result of faculty organizing it is that they didn't want the Women's Center to be under student affairs because of really political reasons over control over what the Women's Center would be able to advocate around. Particularly, DePaul University is a Catholic university, and so that it was very connected to reproductive rights, reproductive justice issues, and whether or not you would have the academic freedom to speak to those issues. Even though I think for many years, Elsa Saeta, who was the director, felt still the constraints of those ideas at DePaul. In any case, it was under academic affairs, whereas the Cultural Center was under student affairs. And the Cultural Center has changed dramatically over the years, and the university is always, in many ways, trying to undermine it. So in a way, the Women's Center was outside of those politics within the university because it was in academic affairs. On the other hand, what happened in academic affairs is that the Women's Center didn't have a lot of visibility. So a lot of people didn't know about it, or, it was hard to, it wasn't centered, in a college or a school within the university. So it's kind of on its own in a way. Still did amazing work in programming. And then about 5 years ago, it switched to be under the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And again, we mobilized for it to become under the college rather than to go over to student affairs. So now it's under the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I took over in 2017 because Elsa Saeta retired. And I was so excited because I'd been partnering with Elsa for years. I'm always organizing events and activities, and I've always been an activist. And so it was just like kind of a dream because it was like, oh, wow, I could do this. So we changed the center again dramatically in the sense that we have this small space in in this building. And it's on the first floor though. It's a small room with a little office area, but we totally changed it. I got rid of all the office furniture and moved in couches and a collective table that people could work on. And we brought in snacks and food and tea and coffee. And I tried to make it a community space because I thought what we were really missing at DePaul was a sense of community. Even I felt often isolated, like doing my own individual thing. And so we've tried to create a very communal space. And the space is organized under an idea of we all belong here. And that really came from an artwork that came out of a lot of the protests around when Trump was elected. And all the ways that he immediately started targeting Muslims, the Muslim community, Black communities, migrant communities, LGBT people, etc. So it was a beautiful poster, and it said, "We all belong here. We will defend each other." So I thought that was such a beautiful, and we still use that. So we have stickers that we encourage everyone to wear, that's "We all belong here." And the idea was that the "we" was something that always had to be built. And so I had kind of a commitment going into the Women's Center that I didn't want it to be the same group of people or a clique of a group of people. So the idea of "we" is always something that's being kind of worked around. So the idea is that everyone is welcome, and that I made sure, like, okay, so I'm the director, I have no other staff working, but I have like 4 or 5 part-time student workers who are also amazing. But I make sure that we're not all the same, like in multiple ways, in terms of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and perspective, so that we would kind of stay away from it becoming kind of a clique. And then we run the center by a set of values. So we always say, everyone is welcome here. You just have to follow the values of being accountable, being aware of your privilege and power, thinking about the impact of who you are, how you interact with people, the ways that we try to build an inclusive space. And so there's always tensions within that. So I think we've succeeded. Like, I think before the pandemic, there would be no sitting room. There'd be like 20 or 30 people in this tiny space coming in, and people working together and talking to each other. And and a lot of student organizations started coming and working with us actively around a whole variety of issues, which also sometimes raised problems within the space, because it's hard to build a "we," kind of really building off Audre Lorde's ideas of really building through attention and accountability around difference and division and inequity and all of those hierarchies. And yet we're committed. So it's a commitment to kind of ongoing conversations to address those difficulties. In any case, that's the idea of it. I also shifted the lens of the center, the goals from kind of women's empowerment and women's leadership to more of a coalition. One of the goals is coalition, collaboration, building community, support and healing and care, and building critical consciousness around power systems. And so those kind of shifted what we started doing in terms of programming and things like that. We're also committed to kind of a multi-generational. So a lot of our events, we try to make it so that there's students, staff, and faculty, multi-generations, having conversations across those differences as well. And then also trying to include students, staff, faculty, and community members. So there's always a sense of multiple people sort of, being part of the conversation. And then we've done incredible collaborations with the people in the groups in student affairs who have more identity-based centers. Also in my overtime, probably. Anyway, I'll just mention 2 projects. Like last year, we had a project 100 Days of Challenging White Supremacy. And we worked with student affairs, and we had students, staff, and faculty do, 100 different people doing 100 different posts. And we do center care. We have healing practices and support groups and all kinds of ways that we have tried to integrate care into everything that we do. And I'm sorry I went over time.
Shenay, would you mind going next? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shenay Bridges-Carter. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the director of the Women's Resource Center at Chicago State University. Chicago State University is a predominantly Black institution located on the south side of Chicago on 95th and King Drive. And I am actually, my official title is the director of the Counseling Center, Abilities Office, and the director of the Women's Resource Center. So all three entities are housed under the same umbrella. The Women's Resource Center came to be really through the activities of the Counseling Center. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist. And the Counseling Center really recognized, I think, the need for a center that specifically spoke to the needs of the women on campus. So at Chicago State University, there is a pretty well-known group of the African American Male Resource Center, and this center has done a lot of work. And so we really recognize that Black women in particular are going to universities at very high rates. I think we make up over 70% of the student population at Chicago State University. And so really felt that that was a big gap, that there was not a resource center specifically designated for women on campus. So over the years, I think the use of the Resource Center, and as many folks might remember, Chicago State a few years ago really got into a lot of financial difficulties. And so a lot of different programs and things were dropped, the Women's Resource Center being one of them. And so in the past, I would say a little over 3 years ago, we were able to kind of re-implement it again under the umbrella of the Counseling Center and Abilities Office. And we really work together very well because we work with students that might have disabilities. Chicago State University has a very high non-traditional student population. So a lot of our female students might not necessarily be traditional college age. They might be parents, they might be caretakers of other family members, definitely working full-time. And we just really wanted to create a center that spoke to the specific and unique needs that people who are mothers on campus, people who are working full-time, people who have a lot of caretaking responsibilities and may also be struggling with their own mental health or disability status might encounter being a student at a university. And so a lot of our programming is around really just creating safe spaces where people can have these conversations and discuss the struggles and identify resources, both on campus as well as off campus. So we do a lot of collaborating with community organizations around supplying information and resources for our students because we recognize that the university cannot meet the needs of all of our students. We also created a food pantry. So we have a student food pantry that is housed within the Women's Resource Center. And this was, again, really geared at looking at food insecurity within our college population. Again, we serve a pretty under-resourced overall student population at Chicago State University. So really recognizing that the need was there, not only for students, but also for staff, some faculty, and community members as well. So the food pantry has been in operation. We began in August 2019. So the pandemic has definitely kind of thrown that a bit into flux, but we are absolutely committed to, continuing to be a resource for students in that way. Let me see. I think that we absolutely really try to recognize the various pressures that being a Black woman in Chicago on the South Side, being at an institution that primarily serves Black students and what that looks like for people. And so we don't shy away from those conversations, and we really work to try and create an environment where not just female identified students, but also students who are male identified, everyone is welcome in the Women's Resource Center. So we tell people, like, don't let the name fool you or scare you away. Everyone is welcome. But we just wanted to create a space that spoke specifically to some of the needs of our students on campus. I think I covered everything. I'm trying to make sure I condense stuff, but maybe we'll get a chance to speak to some more things later. But that's the Women's Resource Center at Chicago State University. Thank you.
I've lost track of who. Sarah, can you go next? I think Sarah hasn't gone.
Sure, thank you. And I got the alert recently that I have an unstable internet. So if I freeze in a very unflattering way, I apologize in advance, and I will join back as soon as possible. Thank you to Natalie, Ramona, Jen. Thank you for hosting this and for inviting us. My name is Sarah Colomé. I use she, her, aya pronouns. I am the director at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign of our Women's Resources Center. I've been here a little over 3.5 years. And it has been quite an adventure, as it sounds like it has been for many of my colleagues in running these spaces. So we are situated within student affairs, similar to many. We are uniquely situated, however, within the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Relations. And so that is the same unit that hosts our other cultural and resource centers on campus. We actually, as a division in student affairs, had a conversation right when I first got here about restructuring, and we advocated pretty strongly to stay within OIIR, specifically because we have and we continue to use Hooks's margin to center framework in the way that we do the work out of the center. And so for us, that really meant that we needed to be in close proximity, partnership, supportive of and accountable to our cultural and resource centers that were serving the most marginalized students on our campus. So we still work with a multitude of other folks, our counseling center, our health center, and others across campus. But for us, it was really important to stay in that space. And so thankfully that was able to happen. We've only been a formal center for about 12 years. So while the work at Urbana-Champaign has been happening for decades, dating back to the 70s, whether it was one person or the Office of Women's Programs out of the Dean of Students office for quite some time, in the late aughts, right around 2007, 2008, thanks to student protest, there were a coalition of faculty and staff, but it is irrefutable that the WRC at UIUC would not exist had it not been for student activists. I mean, there are some very entertaining and well strategized efforts that the students used to be able to establish our center, which was formalized in 2009. We relocated in 2017, and the reason I share that is because that relocation happened right as there was the transition between the founding director, the interim director, and then myself, which got quite complicated because we relocated from that more communal space, as you know, Dr. Russo, you were talking about, to a more office-based space. When I walked in, I used to joke that the space felt like an uncomfortable dentist's office. It just wasn't a space that would want to ask folks to come and like have lunch or organize. I mean, organizers will work with any space, as we know, but it wasn't inviting in this way. And particularly because the name is the Women's Resources Center, there's some stigma that comes with that. So when you have stigma around a name, and then you also have a space that isn't warm and welcoming, one of the biggest things that we did in 2017 was to reshape that space and also shift some of the perceptions that folks had about what the space was meant to be and who it was for. So what's interesting about our space is that we're really, if you think about a Venn diagram with 3 circles, we are really 3 centers in one, maybe 2, depending on how you look at it. We do gender equity work. We do sexual misconduct prevention work. All of the in-person prevention on our campus is done out of our center. And then we are also the designated confidential advisor space for faculty, staff, and students who have been impacted by sexual misconduct. That is in a very small space that we have run out of space for the staff that we have. We have 6 full-time staff right now. We are very lucky to be hopefully adding 1 pending the financial crisis. We are one, as Dr. Bennett was sharing earlier, one of those who has been significantly impacted by the financial strain within the state and because of the pandemic. So we are hoping that some of the benchmarks that we have set will be able to be continued. But at this point, people are graciously sharing space. We are relatively close to the quad, but we aren't necessarily central. We're actually in the middle of the restaurant area. So it's convenient for folks who need resources because you can kind of just slip in. It's not as obvious where you're walking into, but somewhat troublesome when we have evening events and students who are maybe, I don't know, talking about their experiences with sexual assault are pouring out into the drunken street where all the bars are. So there's definitely conversation around thinking about location in the future. We use a collective liberation framework, and that's one of the things that for us was really important with staying with OIIR. For me, when I came, there was a strong foundation, a lot of really fantastic historical programs. And what I heard when I came to campus was that a lot of folks heard that the space was for them, but didn't, when they walked in or saw who was in the space, didn't feel like that matched those values that really were the values, but representation matters, the way that we make ourselves open and available, and that we unpack our own biases and ways that we're contributing to other forms of oppression and harm is really important. And so we did a lot of work in the first couple of years and has continued, which has been reflected in some of those key programs that I would highlight. My staff will probably say, you forgot this one, but if I had to pick a few, our first year campus acquaintance rate program, which is called FICARE, has been around for more than 25 years. We're excited that we were able to hire one of our alums actually to come back and to be restructuring it. The center has really amplified, I think, in the past couple of years, our commitment to being student-centered. And so for us, that means not just listening to the students, but making the changes that they say need to be made. And in many cases, asking them if what the way that we are reacting to what we're hearing is actually meeting what it is that they're asking for, and just using the resources, space, and capacity that we have for them to take the lead in that work, which interestingly seems to be kind of a novel concept, which we are trying to model in the spaces that we occupy. I actually have Dr. Russo to thank for that, in addition to several others. It's interesting to be in a space with somebody who was one of your professors and then to share. So that's really fun for me today to be in that space. We have an ongoing lunch program where we activate our alums and our students, trying to think about what are the spaces where we can be highlighting work that is working to disrupt in a communal, comfortable way. So we provide food. I think, a few others have talked, like Shenay, you were talking about like food insecurity. So how are we matching the actual like lived needs of our students while also making sure that we're advancing the goal, like learning outcomes and the goals of our center. And so for us, that also means thinking about creative ways that we can give back. We have tenure track faculty, we have students who are trying to apply for places. We have platforms to be talking for people to talk about the work that they do in their research. So why not activate those spaces rather than having the same folks coming back that likely have incredible things to share as well, but that already have platforms. I think the other one that the other two that come to mind are our embedded confidential advisor model. So again, the proximity to our cultural resource centers has been so beneficial in so many ways. We were equally hearing that folks didn't, for a number of very obvious reasons, from geographic to perceptual to real, to other forms of harm, that folks weren't feeling like they could access or even understood the availability of resources for survivors. And so over the course of the past year, we've worked really closely with a couple of our cultural centers to create an embedded model that from start to finish was created, implemented, hired with the students from those centers and their staff. So we've been really excited about seeing how that has contributed to growth. Since then, several of us actually came together to share some education around another shared commitment that many of us have within the WRC as well, which is around the fact that we believe that abolition is a feminist issue. They cannot be separated. And so we did a collective program over the fall called We Rise, which were called, we had folks from the state, we had some folks from Chicago, we had some national partners and some of our local community partners talking about what is the historical conversation around abolition? How has it been whitewashed? How has it been removed from the history of the anti-rape movement? what are the roles of particularly queer women of color, particularly Black women who have been removed from that narrative? And then what does that mean for us today? And giving some space for folks to contextualize in their own communities what abolition can and should look like. So we've been really thankful for those partnerships. We regularly work with our Office of Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, with students, with our community partners. And so I'm just checking to see if there was anything else that I wanted to share. Yeah, I think that that's probably the best synopsis of things. We are continually growing. I think that's one of the things that I've been really happy with the team that we have, is that we support each other and recognizing that a commitment to collective liberation, a commitment to a margin to center approach means that we are always going to have things that we need to be deconstructing and improving, and trying to just model what that vulnerability looks like in that growth and in that support of each other.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And last but not least, Rosie.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am very happy to be sharing this space with all of you. My name is Rocio Ayard Ochoa, and my pronouns are she, her. Some of my intersecting identities that I want to highlight today: I'm a cisgender heterosexual woman, a proud first-gen student and first-gen immigrant. I was born in Mexico and raised in California and then moved to the Midwest. I closely identify with my indigenous roots, Chicana and Latina. I currently serve as the director of the Multicultural Center at Western Illinois University, which is in Western Illinois, a pretty rural area. We have two campuses though. We have our Macomb campus and we also have our Quad Cities campus. And I am trying my best to continue in the legacy of amazing past directors. I've been in my role for about 4 years now. And I'll start by sharing a little bit of the history, and then we'll kind of end with some of our signature programming and how we're a site of resistance on this campus. So the Women's Center at Western Illinois University was founded in 1986. And that occurred after members of the Western Organization for Women, composed of faculty, students, graduate assistants, etc., staff members, established that there was a need for a physical space for women to gather for meetings, educational programming, and cultural programming. And so then the Women's Center was founded. It did move 3 different times, in 1995 and in 1999. The third time, where it currently is situated, it was born after many proposals and advocacy for a central location that truly represented all of the needs of the center. And so in 2007, the construction for the new Multicultural Center began, and it opened its doors in the spring of 2009. So we are a fairly new building, 10 years in existence plus. However, the Women's Center, again, was established and founded in 1986. The Multicultural Center currently houses the Gwendolyn Brooks Cultural Center, the LGBTQA Resource Center, and Casa Latina Cultural Center. So we're kind of a quad. It's a beautiful space on campus, one of our newest buildings, and each center is distinct, but we do share our resources, we share our staff, and a lot of the programming as well. Institutionally, we are housed under Student Affairs, and we report directly to the Vice President of Student Services. The staff is composed of myself, the director, a coordinator, an office administrator, 2 graduate assistants, and a good group of student ambassadors, which are our student employees. As far as the work that we do, and talking a little bit more about our signature programs and how we are a form of resistance on campus, we support a welcoming and gender inclusive campus community. We advocate for gender equity, and we do that through the examinations and reflections of, feminism, sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, all of the things that you all have already discussed. And we also we try our best to lead the campus community in the exploration of how gender as a social construct influences those power dynamics and intersects all of our identities. In recent years, we have done a tremendous job of trying to expand the intersecting identities that are represented in the Multicultural Center. And that's been very beautiful to see. It's been a journey of really trying to include and create a welcoming space that represents multiple identities, whereas in years prior, the individuals that frequented the Women's Center was a very specific type of group. And so we've been very successful with that. Part of why we feel that we've been successful with that is we see ourselves as a bridge, as a connector. We really advocate in being what the students need from us. And so we are definitely student-centered, and student development is at the core of our work, while we partner and support faculty and staff, and we also partner with community organizations. Student really is the driving force in the Women's Center. And so we are always very in tune with the needs of the students, and the students' needs dictate our work. And so it does change over the years. However, we do have quite a few legacy programming that have been celebrated, for more than 30 years. And it's always been welcomed with open arms. And so we continue to do it. However, we don't shy away from new initiatives. We've started to have more conversations around masculinity, involve our men in the conversation, and that's been pretty successful. Another legacy program that has been extremely successful, and we've been celebrating it over 30 years, is Take Back the Night and the Vagina Monologues and all of the more traditional programming. However, we are making room for some additional ones. And so Wednesdays with the Women's Center is a very informal program that has started to occur in the Women's Center, and it has been widely and welcomed by students. And I think that the success for that, it is because it is a very low energy, high impact type of event. It is a space where it's very informal. We changed the different activities every other Wednesday, but they range from just healing or mental health promotion, or just building community amongst women, and that's been fairly successful and probably will become one of our staple events for years to come. We also have a strong student organization presence that really creates a great partnership with the students. And so we have organizations that have been around for many, many years, and also help and assist with the programming: Beyond Beautiful, Campus Girl Scouts, Diamond Doll Dance Troupe, the Feminist Action Alliance, and also the Good Girl Movement. So I would say we are currently in terms of our future mission, we're really trying to redefine who we are, because we've seen a lot of new input from students and what they want to see from a women's center. We do have a strong collaboration with the WIRC, who is our center that really promotes awareness for domestic and sexual violence within the community. And so that's a huge part of what we do as well. So I'll stop there, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. You all have in the questions that we've talked about using to frame the conversation, you all have hit on some of the major points. And so I'm sort of going to skip around to questions that are more direct and sort of get into the detail of some of the larger themes that we've got going here. So the first thing that I want to sort of throw out there, and you can popcorn, no particular order, is how does white supremacy show up in your center and on your campus? And some of you have touched on this both historically and contemporarily. And not only how does white supremacy show up, but in what ways has your center engaged anti-racist education and worked with mass movements for justice? Sarah from UC mentioned work around abolitionist feminisms, and that's one way and one outlet, right? But how has your center used or been engaged with Black Lives Matter, prison abolition, reproductive justice movements, environmental justice movements, etc., in addressing white supremacy, not just generally speaking, but specifically on your campuses? Again, we'll just popcorn.
Well, I'll say a couple things. I think one of the things that the Women's Center has tried to do is be cognizant of how white supremacy is showing up all the time. And so we think about how it shows up in our center itself in terms of what we're centering or how things are talked about. So that's always open to kind of scrutiny and conversation. And then the other thing, like I mentioned last year, is that we created a project called 100 Days of Challenging White Supremacy. And in that project, we really tried to get a full range of people from a variety of experiences and backgrounds and perspectives on that question. And then we used the 100 posts to try to create additional conversations. And we're using it again this year where we're interviewing people. We're using Instagram Live. And so somebody can offer their post and then have a conversation around it. And we've also tried to use that within people's courses. And that was one way our goal was really to build in-person circles and reflection circles and discussions. But it was right when the pandemic happened. The other thing that we've been trying to do is that every crisis that's happened, which they're ongoing crises, right? Just constantly with, that started with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last year. What just recently happened with the killings in Atlanta, the pandemic itself. So we started creating resource lists, which would be action plans, building critical consciousness, where you could go for more. We did a lot of work around publicizing around mutual aid work and how to create a mutual aid network or how to get involved in ones in Chicago. So we've tried in various ways to be a place where there's resources and a place to hold conversations. So that's been those have been two of the things that we've been involved in. And we created an anti-racist book club this year, where last quarter we read Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, and we had 5 different meetings so that we could really dig into the book and try to create a conversation around it. So those have been those are a few things that we've tried to do.
I will mention what I was discussing earlier, where our physical space is situated. I think it lends itself to a really good opportunity for us to be able to discuss the intersectionality. And so I think intersectionality has truly been the driving vehicle for us to begin having these conversations and being very intentional. And I think when the populations that we serve represent those very intersecting identities, it is a lot natural and a lot more organic to be able to address these different movements and to address all that we've been doing. So I would say that really helps. There comes some challenges, and we've restructured our organizational chart. And it used to be that there was one director in each center, and now we have more of a inclusion type of model. I'm sure you all probably can imagine the reasons for that. And I think we all kind of, face fiscal challenges at some point. But one of the opportunities or I saw as an opportunity is for us to be more intentional with the work and the programming. And so whereas before each center was doing a specific type of programming, raising awareness of the identities that they raise awareness about, what we were able to do is to fully engage in the full conversation and bring everything to the table. And so that is a really good way for us to be able to do that. I do believe that even if we weren't in the same space, we would still be striving for that. But it's a lot easier when when you're serving the populations with multiple identities. And I think that that's very key. So that would be my advice, or my words of wisdom is if we are not serving the populations that have multiple intersecting identities, if we're not serving all identities, then it's really hard to get at the core of this work. And that's what's really worked well for us.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Okay. I will say, so just recently, because in Women's History Month, we did some work with, we did a series of interviews, live streaming interviews with mutual aid organizations around Chicago. So Brave Space Alliance, Food Farm Familias, Chicago Community Bond Fund, Asada's Daughters. And part of the point of that is to help them get the word out, for us to learn about what mutual aid actually looks like as part of our growth. And just to be honest about it, because like knowing where we are, it was to spend some of Northwestern's money in places that could use it better maybe than we could. And so that's one thing that we can do, being in an institution that has resources, is redirect some of those resources in ways that we think will benefit communities and fight white supremacy. And I will say also that, you know, our center has a history of Black women leadership, and there's a lot of explicit white supremacy that has come our way. I think people in these positions probably get this a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of even just people sort of leapfrogging to senior, more Black women to talk to me, even though, you know, I was junior to them, that I think are we don't necessarily need to separate out who's a misogynist and who's a racist in these cases. They're probably both. But something that I've grown into in this time is that I try not to give those people too much of my attention. I think their intention is to distract us from the work we're doing, and I try not to be distracted, and instead to focus on things like combating performative white allyship within our own center and within our own partners that we have around campus. So some of the work that like y'all have been talking about consciousness raising feels really critical. Because I think, as we all know, it can be so burdensome when folks come into these spaces and they're like, okay, you know, as a white person, I'm going to show up here having never read a Black feminist text and ask you to explain to me some very basic ideas. And it's like, I have a library card. I can come informed and humble at the same time. And just trying to create that kind of culture amongst those of us who are white and cis in these spaces, I think is something that's important to me.
Dr. Bridges-Carter, did you want to say anything before? Okay. Might be helpful to not then remute myself. I was the one that did it, everyone. You're welcome. So I would echo much of what's been said. So speaking truth to power in the spaces that we're in, particularly, you know, as someone who's white presenting, as somebody who's cis, as someone who works in a center where the topics that we address are getting traction right now in some ways, thinking about what that looks like, I would very much echo with the limited amount of funding that we have, being very thoughtful about where money goes. And I would say that that is both externally to the community. So in a similar fashion, like, you know, we work with like BYP 100, because I think there's many ways that they could be using that money well, that doesn't need to be out of our center, right? So thinking about that, but then also thinking institutionally, we know that folks that serve marginalized populations on our campus are disproportionately underfunded. And then with everything that's happening now, that that disparity is growing. And so when we have funds available, what does that look like? And really thinking about like what kind of conditions are set on that. So it doesn't have to be that we are you know, a named partner. It doesn't have to be that we have any rights to approvals or design. It can just say like, I believe in this program, I have funding, and I know that you need some, and then offering and not assuming. So saying, where can this best serve what you need right now? I think sometimes we assume that we know. And so that has been something, one of the many ways that we do that I'm thankful for, because that's something that's modeled throughout our division. I think equally what I would also add to what has been shared is continuing, because it exists, but amplifying the weaving of an intersectional narrative. Our campus is particularly siloed. I'm sure no one else can relate to that in the way that work is done. And so when we have the opportunity to share how addressing sexual misconduct and ending rape culture will not happen unless we are also ending other forms of oppression and harm that all stem from the same forms of harm, that's a position that we have available to us, and to provide new narrative in that way. I also think about, when we think about white supremacy how that shows up in organizational habits, and then naming that and creating space where we can name that, particularly in higher education around like perfectionism, quantity over quality. There are things that we still struggle with in our center. There are things that I as a leader struggle with, but creating a space where we have a shared language to be able to challenge each other to take a step back and think about how well we are sharing our values, our actions might be conveying something different, is something I know that we are, I won't say that we are done doing, because I don't think you're ever done with that, but that is an area that I think in our center we are trying to continue to work through, so that it's not just what we are putting out, but also in the way that we work with and for folks.
So I would say that at Chicago State University, we actually don't spend a lot of time talking about white supremacy in terms of how it impacts our students. And I think that that is probably because it's almost like an unspoken thing. A lot of our students, again, because our student population is predominantly Black, as well as a lot of our administration, I don't think it's necessarily as in your face as it might be at a predominantly white institution, but just talking about it in terms of how it impacts other systems. So employment, how it impacts access to other resources. But one of the things in terms of oppression generally, I think we spend a lot of time talking and trying to work with some of our more male-centered student groups around like toxic masculinity and how that impacts primarily like Black relationships, Black families, and just how we can engage with one another, even non-romantically, right, in a more healthy, reciprocal way that is respectful of one another. So that's absolutely something that's like a never-ending conversation, and just about like the emotional and mental labor that is put on women in a lot of ways, which, you know, is not something unique to Black women specifically, but just, you know, women in general. But that's primarily what we speak about.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question about opportunity, right? And this aligns with this theme of resistance. Where do you see opportunities and challenges in your centers working with and in other university spaces that promote inclusion, right? And build institutional capacity to resist conservative attacks on students and universities? So not one in particular, not one conservative attack in particular, but thinking very broadly here, all the isms, right? White supremacist attacks, anti-immigrant campaigns, anti-abortion campaigns, anti-queer and trans groups, any sort of right-wing agenda. What are the challenges that you're facing and the opportunities that you're finding in the spaces that you exist in across your campuses?
I can go, I guess. So one thing that I often find we discuss is kind of fighting against the bootstrap mentality, and really the idea of like, you know, this myth of meritocracy and people really feeling that if they aren't super successful, you know, at a young age or even in, you know, older ages, that's somehow due to a lack of effort or a lack of preparedness on their part, as opposed to systemic issues that exist that present obstacles. And so we oftentimes end up kind of having those conversations because a lot of times people are blaming themselves, right? I didn't achieve this because I didn't try, or I made wrong decisions. And, you know, not trying to, you know, alleviate people of any sort of personal accountability, but just pointing out the fact that there are systemic issues and biases that are also contributing to this outcome that we're seeing, and really kind of trying to put blame, so to speak, where it belongs, and really kind of alleviating folks of that aspect of, self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, self-esteem, which can really end up being detriment to people's mental health, and therefore their ability to really perform well in the classroom. And so we, definitely encourage people to take advantage of the various resources that we have, and really to kind of try and position themselves for success, but to know that when they fall short, that we are there to support them and to help them get back on their feet, and to know that no one succeeds without help from someone. And so we definitely find ourselves kind of trying to fight the bootstrap mentality, but it's like a never ending fight that like we're always be fighting. So, yeah.
I guess, thank you, Shenay. I think one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is really thinking about the impact of whatever, whatever's happening, the deep impact on people, on the students themselves, or also staff and faculty, and also their families and communities. So like thinking about needing to resist, but also to create spaces of support and care and kind of counter narratives, so people aren't internalizing whatever it is people are saying. And so I think that we've been trying to think a lot more this year about spaces. How can we create more spaces of care that directly address those impacts? Like one of the things we've been thinking a lot about, and I think we're going to implement it this quarter, is trying to create more spaces for grieving and mourning of just people's losses, the losses from all of the violence, all of these different systems, and in terms of health and the pandemic. And then I think the other thing we've really been trying to do is think about how it's kind of thinking about that idea that whatever is happening, to ask more questions about it, so we can get at that intersectional understanding of what's happened, so that, and then try to build collaborations with other departments and student centers, and so that we have a sense that, of a deeper and broader impact on people, and try to address it from that more intersectional, because I think sometimes people think, oh, well, that just only affects this group. But actually it impacts all of us, and that group is part of multiple groups, and really taking that intersectional and more complex lens to it. So I think it's both that and the need for people to be nourished and cared for, and even for the resistance, for people to fight. It's like, it's so wearing, and in fact, we've switched our newsletter. Our newsletter is often like care strategies and how to get through the week, and as well as here are protests that are going on and organizations you can contribute to, and events, but also just like a recognition of the deep harms that are happening and their impact on people and their communities and our communities.
One of the things that we've really done a lot of in the last few years is combating neutrality. This idea that we as individuals of belonging to higher education system, we can't choose a side, right? We have to support freedom of speech, and I think that that's a huge challenge that we all face. But really getting at the core and allowing students to feel extremely comfortable and owning their words and talking about intent versus impact. And there's no such thing as neutrality, and I think we have to own that as student affairs practitioners or any member of higher education, that there is a boundary that we can't cross. We have to own our knowledge, we have to own our growth, and we have to really advocate for students to understand the impact that words do have, and not necessarily embody this idea of, we're kind of the Midwest nice type of mentality. And so combating neutrality is a huge one for us.
One that we've talked a lot about in our center lately is around the weaponization of self-care. And so thinking about how, what responsibilities do we have in not perpetuating that, in speaking to when that's happening. And so thinking about, not that practices to care for ourselves or anything that's wrong. I'm a huge proponent of the NAP ministry, among many others, but I think the ways, particularly now that is being promoted without folks who are sitting, folks and organizations that are sitting with positional power, not thinking about how they can create scenarios where that is less the responsibility of an individual and it's more of a community collective commitment to care. I think that particularly, it's always been something that we need to do better and is much more in line with feminist theories, but I think particularly now we have an opportunity to point out what that doesn't look like.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and you just really, Sarah, really brought up for me that sorry, my mind is like drawing a blank. The free speech that Rocio was talking about, that argument is huge here. The idea that somebody who's arguing that you can't exist is somehow like a valid perspective that we need to take into consideration is just so damaging. And I think, right, so that's where my brain went. The self-care issue is that I think sometimes people use that as a way to not address harm. Like, you should repair yourself, as opposed to we should have less situations in which harm is being done to you. It's like cheaper and easier to sell people. And again, that is not the same thing as intentional self-care that is meant to really help people. But I think for me too, I feel like being in places where harm is happening. During the WCC summit last year, I went to UIC's panel on working with Greek life. And because that's something I'm trying to learn better, is like how to actually get into the spaces where the mindsets need to be changed, and to take that cultural change up as my own project. In addition to being there for the people who are sort of surviving those circumstances. So.
We have time for maybe one or two questions. If anyone wants to put one in the chat. If not, I'll draw your attention to the chat where Ramona says, our wonderful speakers have named a lot of great organizations and resources throughout the program. So they'll be able to collect those and send out a follow-up email. I'm going to go back to the framing questions and talk about thinking ahead, right, as our concluding portion. And in 1 minute, which is about the amount of time we have for each of you to say something, in 1 minute, how do you imagine us working together to advocate for social justice across respective campuses? I'll ask Anne to go first so that we can get it in before 2 o'clock.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just how you can envision us here collectively today, this community of folks working together across respective campuses.
Okay, I guess I envision us trying to meet again. So I think that would be the first thing, and I also think that there's so many different things came up and there's so many different issues, and we're also at very different campuses. And so I think like trying to figure out ways to gather more, to share resources more, to, and also to talk about really tough issues like around Title IX or issues around university policies, or how to center the people who are most marginalized, or how to really meet the needs. Anyway, so my vision would be to gather more and often.
I just echo what Anne said. I think it would be nice if we could have like a little conference or something where not just staff, but also the students who are interested in these topics could come together and have kind of like affinity groups around certain areas of interest. I, can think about like housing insecurity and domestic violence and issues like that, that absolutely, have overarching ramifications across campuses. And I know that there are more of those issues than probably we're aware of. So just kind of connecting with one another so that we can connect students across campuses to get together.
I would say mine is more long-term, yes, to meeting more often and making space for these wonderful connections because they are valuable. But long-term, I would like there to be this radical thought of maybe not necessarily needing these spaces, these centers on a campus, not because we don't want to uplift each other, but because the gaps or the needs or meeting those students' needs is not necessarily such a prominent staple of what the college experience is like. And so if that's where I'm going, I'm envisioning a space near the future where our multicultural centers, our centers are not going to be a need. And that's radical in nature, right? Because I can't imagine us not existing. But if we don't exist in 20 years from 30 years from now, I would hope that it's because we've done the work and we've really transformed our society.
I would echo much of what's been shared. I appreciate that forward vision, Rocio. I think about meeting together and mapping, understand that as has been stated, we're different.
Sarah, I think your internet connection is lost. I'm going to go to Sarah Brown, and then if you come back, we'll come back to you, okay?
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I just echo everything that's been said and will add my own 2 cents that I haven't been here that long, and it already feels hard to imagine myself outside of the limits of the culture that I belong to. So speaking to other centers on other campuses just like kind of wakes your brain up and gets you out of like, what is it that Northwestern will or won't let me do or whatever, so I appreciate that so much.
Well, has lost connection completely. That's unfortunate. Made it through all the way to the last minute. But I want to thank you all for being with us. This was fantastic. I put in the chat to our constituency group page on our NWSA website. We have a Women's Centers Committee that most of you whose names are, if I don't know you, I do recognize your name because you're a part of that in some kind of way. Oh, there you are, Sarah. Would you like to offer up what you were going to offer?
Wind and technology are not good bedfellows. Yes, so I will make it short. Mapping so we understand our strengths and we can be uplifting each other and not duplicating where we don't need to create a collective strength. And I think toward that future vision, what I just kept thinking is how in Illinois can we be organizing to however we want organizing to look like, to be advancing the things that despite our differences as institutions and communities best serve the folks that we are charging ourselves and that we have been charged to support.
Thank you so much. So yeah, so if you're not a part of NWSA, please check out our website we have a Women's Centers Committee. There's a pre-conference that happens every year before our conference. This year's conference is virtual and our Women's Centers are going to do a pre-conference. And so it's a really good moment for building community and for sharing resources and strategy across campuses. I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie and Ramona, but thank you all for being with us. It's been a pleasure to be your hostess today.
Thank you so much, Jen, for helping us move through really full conversation. I feel like echoing Sarah Colomé, that we just started to really map, I think, what we can do together in a really kind of powerful way. Like I already can see like conversations that we should have, special events that we can actually do together. So I think this roundtable kind of exceeded or expectations. I mean, we didn't have any. Really, all we wanted to do was to meet. But I think that this has been incredibly insightful, enriching, energizing for me, reminding me of some of the things that I know that I said I wanted to do once I came to the center, but bureaucratic institutional madness, like stalls a lot of work. It reminds me to return to that. And it also reminds me that we have each other, right? And in a way, I think we need to remind ourselves of that pretty constantly as we build the we, right? As we become more inclusive, as we start to figure out how to connect with communities that we don't necessarily have strong alliances to, right? So I think we didn't talk in our conversation at all about what it means to create programming that addresses the needs of gender nonconforming folks. We haven't talked about what does it mean to be a women's center that is inclusive and a safe space for trans women. We haven't talked that much about, like, we touched on economic insecurity. There are layers to that. So we, I think, have some really amazing possibilities ahead of us. And I look forward to all of what is to come. Thank you to everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being witness to this conversation. Thank you for your energies. And let's continue to celebrate WLRC's 30th. We have a student centered panel coming up April 9th, where we are having graduate students who have been part of the center talk about what it's meant in terms of their professional development, their own political education, all of it. We never have enough time for these conversations. So until next time, take care.